Section 17 of The Captain of the Polestar and Other Tales by Arthur Conan Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. John Huxford's Hiatus, Part 3. On one occasion he had, in the interest of the firm, to journey to Quebec and to visit the very cork factory which had tempted him to leave England. Strolling through the workroom with the foreman, John automatically, and without knowing what he was doing, picked up a square piece of the bark and fashioned it, with 2 or 3 deft cuts of his penknife, into a smooth, tapering cork. His companion picked it out of his hand and examined it with the eye of an expert. "This is not the first cork which you have cut by many a hundred, Mr. Hardy," he remarked. "Indeed you are wrong," John answered, smiling. "I have never cut one before in my life." "Impossible!" cried the foreman. "Here's another bit of cork. Try again." John did his best to repeat the performance, but the brains of the manager interfered with the trained muscles of the cork cutter. The latter had not forgotten their cunning, but they needed to be left to themselves, and not directed by a mind which knew nothing of the matter. Instead of the smooth, graceful shape, he could produce nothing but rough-hewn, clumsy cylinders. "It must have been chance," said the foreman, "but I could have sworn that it was the work of an old hand." As the years passed, John's smooth English skin had warped and crinkled until he was as brown and as seamed as a walnut. His hair, too, after many years of iron gray, had finally become as white as the winters of his adopted country. Yet he was a hale, upright old man, and when he at last retired from the managership of the firm with which he had been so long connected, he bore the weight of his 70 years lightly and bravely. He was in the peculiar position himself of not knowing his own age, as it was impossible for him to do more than guess at how old he was at the time of his accident. The Franco-German War came round, and while the 2 great rivals were destroying each other, their more peaceful neighbors were quietly ousting them out of their markets and their commerce. Many English ports benefited by this condition of things, but none more than Brisport. It had long ceased to be a fishing village, but was now a large and prosperous town, with a great breakwater in place of the quay on which Mary had stood, and a frontage of terraces and grand hotels, where all the grandees of the West Country came when they were in need of a change. All these extensions had made Brisport the center of a busy trade, and her ships found their way into every harbor in the world. Hence it was no wonder, especially in that very busy year of 1870, that several Brisport vessels were lying in the river alongside the wharves of Quebec. One day John Hardy, who found time hang a little on his hands since his retirement from business, strolled along by the water's edge, listening to the clanking of the steam winches and watching the great barrels and cases as they were swung ashore and piled upon the wharf. He had observed the coming in of a great ocean steamer, and having waited until she was safely moored, he was turning away when a few words fell upon his ear, uttered by someone on board a little weather-beaten bark close by him. It was only some commonplace order that was bawled out, but the sound fell upon the old man's ears with a strange mixture of disuse and familiarity. He stood by the vessel and heard the seamen at their work, all speaking with the same broad, pleasant, jingling accent. Why did it send such a thrill through his nerves to listen to it? He sat down upon a coil of rope and pressed his hands to his temples, drinking in the long-forgotten dialect, and trying to piece together in his mind the 1,000 half-formed nebulous recollections which were surging up in it. Then he rose, and walking along to the stern, he read the name of the ship. The Sunlight, Brisport. Brisport? Again that flush and tingle through every nerve. Why was that word and the men's speech so familiar to him? He walked moodily home, and all night he lay tossing and sleepless, pursuing a shadowy something which was ever within his reach, and yet which ever evaded him. Early next morning he was up and down on the wharf, listening to the talk of the West Country sailors. Every word they spoke seemed to him to revive his memory and bring him nearer to the light. From time to time they paused in their work, and seeing the white-haired stranger sitting so silently and attentively, they laughed at him and broke little jests upon him. And even these jests had a familiar sound to the exile, as they very well might, seeing that they were the same which he had heard in his youth, for no one ever makes a new joke in England. So he sat through the long day, bathing himself in the West Country speech and waiting for the light to break. And it happened that when the sailors broke off for their midday meal, one of them, either out of curiosity or good nature, came over to the old watcher and greeted him. So John asked him to be seated on a log by his side, and began to put many questions to him about the country from which he came, and the town, all of which the man answered glibly enough, for there is nothing in the world that a sailor loves to talk of so much as his native place. For it pleases him to show that he is no mere wanderer, but that he has a home to receive him whenever he shall choose to settle down to a quiet life. So the seaman prattled away about the town hall and the Martello Tower, and the Esplanade, and Pitt Street, and High Street, until his companion suddenly shot out a long eager arm and caught him by the wrist. "Look here, man," he said, in a low, quick whisper. "Answer me truly, as you hope for mercy. Are not the streets that run out of High Street, Fox Street, Caroline Street, and George Street, in the order named?" "They are," the sailor answered, shrinking away from the wild flashing eyes. And at that moment John's memory came back to him, and he saw clear and distinct his life as it had been and as it should have been, with every minutest detail traced as in letters of fire. Too stricken to cry out, too stricken to weep, he could only hurry away homeward wildly and aimlessly, hurry as fast as his aged limbs would carry him, as if, poor soul, there was some chance yet of catching up the 50 years which had gone by. Staggering and tremulous, he hastened on until a film seemed to gather over his eyes, and throwing his arms into the air with a great cry, "Oh, Mary, Mary! Oh, my lost, lost life!" he fell senseless upon the pavement. The storm of emotion which had passed through him, and the mental shock which he had undergone, would have sent many a man into a raging fever. But John was too strong-willed and too practical to allow his strength to be wasted at the very time when he needed it most. Within a few days he realized a portion of his property, and starting for New York, caught the first mail steamer to England. Day and night, night and day, he trod the quarter-deck, until the hardy sailors watched the old man with astonishment, and marveled how any human being can do so much upon so little sleep. It was only by this unceasing exercise, by wearing down his vitality until fatigue brought him lethargy, that he could prevent himself from falling into a very frenzy of despair. He hardly dare ask himself what was the object of this wild journey. What did he expect? Would Mary be still alive? She must be a very old woman. If he could but see her and mingle his tears with hers, he would be content. Let her only know that it had been no fault of his, and that they had both been victims of the same cruel fate. The cottage was her own, and she had said that she would wait for him there until she heard from him. Poor lass, she had never reckoned on such a wait as this. At last the Irish lights were sighted and passed. Land's End lay like a blue fog upon the water, and the great steamer ploughed its way along the bold Cornish coast until it dropped its anchor in Plymouth Bay. John hurried to the railway station, and within a few hours he found himself back once more in his native town, which he had quitted, a poor cork cutter, half a century before. But was it the same town? Were it not for the name engraved all over the station and on the hotels, John might have found a difficulty in believing it. The broad, well-paved streets, with the tram lines laid down the center, were very different from the narrow, winding lanes which he could remember. The spot upon which the station had been built was now the very center of the town, but in the old days it would have been far out in the fields. In every direction lines of luxurious villas branched away in streets and crescents bearing names which were new to the exile. Great warehouses and long rows of shops with glittering fronts showed him how enormously Brisport had increased in wealth as well as in dimensions. It was only when he came upon the old High Street that John began to feel at home. It was much altered, but still it was recognizable, and some few of the buildings were just as he had left them. There was the place where Fairbairn's cork works had been. It was now occupied by a great brand-new hotel, and there was the old gray town hall. The wanderer turned down beside it, and made his way with eager steps but a sinking heart in the direction of the line of cottages which he used to know so well. It was not difficult for him to find where they had been. The sea, at least, was as old, and from it he could tell where the cottages had stood. But alas, where were they now? In their place, an imposing crescent of high stone houses reared their tall front to the beach. John walked wearily down past their palatial entrances, feeling heartsore and despairing, when suddenly a thrill shot through him, followed by a warm glow of excitement and of hope. For, standing a little back from the line, and looking as much out of place as a bumpkin in a ballroom, was an old whitewashed cottage, with wooden porch and walls bright with creeping plants. He rubbed his eyes and stared again, but there it stood, with its diamond-paned windows and white muslin curtains, the very same, down to the smallest details, as it had been on the day when he last saw it. Brown hair had become white, and fishing hamlets had changed into cities, but busy hands and a faithful heart had kept Granny's cottage unchanged and ready for the wanderer. And now, when he had reached his very haven of rest, John Huxford's mind became more filled with apprehension than ever, and he came over so deadly sick that he had to sit down upon one of the beach benches which faced the cottage. An old fisherman was perched at one end of it, smoking his black clay pipe, and he remarked upon the wan face and sad eyes of the stranger. "You have overtired yourself," he said. "It doesn't do for old chaps like you and me to forget our years." "I'm better now, thank you," John answered. "Can you tell me, friend, how that one cottage came among all those fine houses?" "Why," said the old fellow, thumping his crutch energetically upon the ground, "that cottage belongs to the most obstinate woman in all of England. That woman, if you'll believe me, has been offered the price of the cottage 10 times over, and yet she won't part with it. They have even promised to remove it stone by stone, and put it up on some more convenient place, and pay her a good round sum into the bargain. But God bless you, she wouldn't so much as hear of it." "And why was that?" asked John. "Well, that's just the funny part of it. It was all on account of a mistake. You see, her spark went away when I was a youngster, and she got it into her head that he may come back some day, and that he won't know where to go unless the cottage is there. Why, if the fellow were alive, he would be as old as you, but I've no doubt he's dead long ago. She's well quit of him, for he must have been a scamp to abandon her as he did." "Oh, he abandoned her, did he?" "Yes, went off to the States, and never so much as sent a word to bid her good-bye. It was a cruel shame, it was, for the girl has been a-waiting and a-pining for him ever since. It's my belief that it's 50 years of weeping that blinded her." "She is blind?" cried John, half rising to his feet. "Worse than that," said the fisherman. "She's mortal ill, and not expected to live. Why, look ye, there's the doctor's carriage a-waiting at her door." At this evil tidings, old John sprang up and hurried over to the cottage, where he met the physician returning to his brougham. "How is your patient, doctor?" he asked in a trembling voice. Very bad," said the man of medicine pompously. "If she continues to sink, she will be in great danger. But if, on the other hand, she takes a turn, it is possible that she may recover," with which oracular answer he drove away in a cloud of dust. John Huxford was still hesitating at the doorway, not knowing how to announce himself, or how far a shock might be dangerous to the sufferer, when a gentleman in black came bustling up. "Can you tell me, my man, if this is where the sick woman is?" he asked. John nodded, and the clergyman passed in, leaving the door half open. The wanderer waited until he had gone into the inner room, and then slipped into the front parlor, where he had spent so many happy hours. All was the same as ever, down to the smallest ornaments, for Mary had been in the habit, whenever anything was broken, of replacing it with a duplicate, so that there might be no change in the room. He stood irresolute, looking about him, until he heard a woman's voice from the inner chamber, and stealing to the door, he peeped in. The invalid was reclining upon a couch, propped up with pillows, and her face was turned full towards John as he looked round the door. He could have cried out as his eyes rested upon it, for there were Mary's pale, plain, sweet, homely features, as smooth and as unchanged as though she were still the half-child, half-woman whom he had pressed to his heart on the Brisport quay. Her calm, eventless, unselfish life had left none of those rude traces upon her countenance which are the outward emblems of internal conflict and an unquiet soul. A chaste melancholy had refined and softened her expression, and her loss of sight had been compensated for by the placidity which comes upon the face of the blind. With her silver hair peeping out beneath her snow-white cap, and a bright smile upon her sympathetic face, she was the old Mary improved and developed, with something ethereal and angelic superadded. "You will keep a tenant in the cottage," she was saying to the clergyman, who sat with his back turned to the observer. "Choose some poor deserving folk in the parish who will be glad of a free home, and when he comes you will tell him that I have waited for him until I have been forced to go on, but that he will find me on the other side still faithful and true. There's a little money, too, only a few pounds, but I should like him to have it when he comes, for he may need it. And then you will tell the folk you put in to be kind to him, for he will be grieved, poor lad, and to tell him that I was cheerful and happy up to the end. Don't let him know that I ever fretted, or he may fret too." Now John listened quietly to all this from behind the door, and more than once he had to put his hand to his throat. But when she had finished, and when he thought of her long, blameless, innocent life, and saw the dear face looking straight at him, and yet unable to see him, it became too much for his manhood, and he burst out into an irrepressible, choking sob which shook his very frame. And then occurred a strange thing, for though he had spoken no word, the old woman stretched out her arms to him and cried, "Oh, Johnny, Johnny! Oh, dear, dear Johnny! You have come back to me again." And before the parson could at all understand what had happened, the two faithful lovers were in each other's arms, weeping over each other, and patting each other's silvery heads with their hearts so full of joy that it almost compensated for all the weary 50 years of waiting. It's hard to say how long they rejoiced together. It seemed a very short time to them, and a very long one to the reverend gentleman, who was thinking at last of stealing away, when Mary recollected his presence, and the courtesy which was due to him. "My heart is full of joy, sir," she said. "It is God's will that I should not see my Johnny, but I can call up his image as clear as if I had my eyes. Now stand up, John, and I will let the gentleman see how well I remember you. He is as tall, sir, as the second shelf, as straight as an arrow, his face brown, and his eyes bright and clear. His hair is well nigh black, and his mustache the same. I shouldn't wonder if he had whiskers as well by this time. Now, sir, don't you think I can do without my sight?" The clergyman listened to her description, and looking at the battered, white-haired man before him, he hardly knew whether to laugh or to cry. But it all proved to be a laughing matter in the end, for whether it was that her illness had taken some natural turn, or that John's return had startled it away, it is certain that from that day Mary steadily improved, until she was as well as ever. "No special license for me," John had said sturdily. "It looks as if we were ashamed of what we are doing, as though we hadn't the best right to be married of any two folk in the parish." So the banns were put up accordingly, and 3 times it was announced that John Huxford, bachelor, was going to be united to Mary Howden, spinster, after which, no one objecting, they were duly married accordingly. "We may not have very long in this world," said old John, "but at least we shall start fair and square in the next." John's share in the Quebec business was sold out, and gave rise to a very interesting legal question as to whether, knowing that his name was Huxford, he could still sign that of Hardy, as was necessary for the completion of the business. It was decided, however, that on his producing 2 trustworthy witnesses to his identity, all would be right, so the property was duly realized and produced a very handsome fortune. Part of this John devoted to building a pretty villa just outside Brisport, and the heart of the proprietor of Beach Terrace leaped within him when he learned that the cottage was at last to be abandoned, and that it would no longer break the symmetry and impair the effects of his row of aristocratic mansions. And there, in their snug new home, sitting out on the lawn in the summer time, and on either side of the fire in the winter, that worthy old couple continued for many years to live as innocently and as happily as 2 children. Those who knew them well say that there was never a shadow between them, and that the love which burned in their aged hearts was as high and as holy as that of any young couple who ever went to the altar. And through all the country round, if ever man or woman were in distress and fighting against hard times, they had only to go up to the villa to receive help, and that sympathy which is more precious than help. So when at last John and Mary fell asleep in their ripe old age, within a few hours of each other, they had all the poor and the needy and the friendless of the parish among their mourners, and in talking over the troubles which these 2 had faced so bravely, they learned that their own miseries also but were passing things, and that faith and truth can never miscarry, either in this existence or the next. End of section 17.